Hello and welcome back to Bigfoot Lake. Tonight we have two fantastic encounters from the state of Washington, that Pacific Northwest area, which is considered to be a mecca for Bigfoot sightings. So that's where we're headed today, to that Pacific Northwest. So with that being said, pull up a stump, sit back, relax, and let's dive into the first of our two encounters from the state of Washington. The first encounter is from Cowlitz County, Washington, near Longview, July of 1984. As far as my sighting goes, I was heading home with my roommate from the movies. This was in either June or July of 1984, but I believe it was July as it was quite warm. We were driving west along the Columbia River on State Route 4, about 7 miles west of Longview, when I saw what I thought might be a bear on the riverside, south of the guardrail, just above the river. I slowed my truck to a crawl to get a better view as we neared it. All of a sudden, this quote-unquote bear stood up to a height of about 9 feet and stepped over the guardrail on 2 legs. I stopped the truck and hit the high beams, and I knew right away what I was seeing was a Bigfoot. I could actually see what appeared to be very small genitalia even. Up until that very moment, I had never believed in the Sasquatch. As I so avidly hunted and fished the mountains of Washington and had never before seen one, nor had I noticed any signs of one. Of course, I hadn't been looking for any either. Well, there it was, right in front of me. It was the male version of Patty, only larger and more muscled. It was not a shaggy-haired animal, but quite the opposite. It was covered in a sleek black hair or fur, maybe 2 or 3 inches long. In fact, it looked a great deal like black bear fur, except that the hair was a bit longer on its shoulders and upper back. As it stepped over that guardrail, my mind went into the never forget what you're seeing mode, and I can play it repeatedly in my head. This thing was giant in stature, yet walked with very fluid movement. It was amazingly graceful. Its head was slightly pointed and its jaw was massive. 2 steps or so onto the road and it turned and looked right at the truck. Doing so caused its body to turn with the head after a slight turn of the neck. At this point it furrowed its brow in what I took to be a look of anger and disgust. It really looked angry. It continued across the road where there was an incline of approximately 60 degrees. It proceeded to walk up this incline on 2 legs. I even pointed the truck in that direction to see it walk up that incline and observe its musculature. I was very into bodybuilding at that point in life, and its musculature was totally incredible. You could see the muscles rippling and bulging under the hair. One thing I noticed that was every time it put its weight on one leg, a very large muscle bulged from just above the knee and traveled all the way up the leg to the side of its glutes. It also walked with its knees slightly bent and a strangely exaggerated arm swing. I was in awe, while my friend was so damn scared he refused to even watch. He kept yelling, "What is it? What is it?" I turned and looked at him and said, "That was a Bigfoot." I told my family and even they said I was nuts. As for my friend, it took me until 3 years ago to get him to admit that he actually saw it. As far as everyone else is concerned, I do not give a damn what they think. I know what I saw, and I know it could never have been hoaxed. I saw on that night a large male Bigfoot. I would take a lie detector test, go under hypnosis, or anything else to prove I am telling the God's truth. So anyone that wants to pay for either of those, feel free to ask me, and I will agree, no problem. So that's a pretty sensational encounter from Cowlitz County, Washington. Like I said, that Pacific Northwest area is just world famous for Bigfoot sightings. So yeah, let me know if you've heard of any other encounters near that Cowlitz County area, just west of Longview. And I'd appreciate your comments or any thoughts about that area. So with that being said, let's move on to our second encounter of the night, and this is a quite fantastic encounter. This comes from Darrington, Washington, in the Cascade Mountains. On July 15th of 1989, I had intended to meet my parents near the town of Darrington, Washington, for a simple day hike and some later blueberry picking. We were to meet at the corner monument of Section 27, T32N, Route 9 East, which lies on the roadway to the Squire Creek Trailhead, a remote location that isn't the normal haunt of the weekend backpacker. I was there because of my necessity for completion of mining assessment work to 2 claims, which I held there for several years. On this particular day, I arrived about 10 a.m. with my son Rolf and his friend David. It was a typical early summer day in the mountains, light fog in the canyons and heavy shadows in the tree line. Warm and enjoyable, perfect weather for a brisk hike. This would occur later when my father, mother, and niece arrived at about 11:30 a.m. We took a light lunch break and 3 of us continued up the hill while the 2 boys and my mother remained at the cars. In about 10 minutes, we had made the first hillside above the road. It brought us about 80 feet up to a large plateau that was somewhat open but not heavily traveled, as I had only found this location a short time before. Long enough to have ribboned the trail and investigated the tunnels for dangers. I had also explored the remains of an old mining cabin, collected samples, and posted the site in error. My job was to remove the inaccuracies and bring the claim into compliance. This required me to part company at this plateau and venture off the trail about 200 feet. I had told my father and niece to wait at the site and I would return shortly. 10 minutes later, I returned and they were gone. I called out and received no reply to my hails. Angered that they had gone ahead, I returned to the bush and took a few samples. About 15 minutes later, I returned to the trail and questioned where they had gone. Both were emphatic that they had not ventured from the spot, but my father seemed preoccupied by voices that he claimed he had heard. A garbled, mumbling speech that resembled the sound of dwarves arguing over a card hand. I passed it off to the carry of the boys' voices from below the bank, but he insisted otherwise. With that, we continued on our way and investigated the tunnels without incident. After about an hour hike to the upper tunnels, my father and niece decided to return to the vehicles. Dad would have liked to have continued the hike, but was worried about the safety of my niece, Tina, so he accompanied her back to the cars. I said my goodbyes and continued on my way, onto a trail that I had been on only the week before. As I looked around, it was difficult to determine exactly what I was seeing. The trail looked like it had been obliterated in some cataclysmic fashion. Huge rocks were out of place, trees broken over, and the hillside ripped loose. I couldn't even discern the ribbons I had placed to mark my previous trip. It was as though the hand of God had slapped the hillside and jarred it beyond recognition. I couldn't even tell if I would be able to regain the trail without rope and pitons to secure my travel. It was devastation, so much that I abandoned the monument I was carrying so I could use both hands to pull myself up to the trail. I was standing in an area more familiar but equally as unusual. Here I could see the ribbons I had placed, but they were laying on trees that were now on the ground. Large conifers were snapped off, 3 and 4 feet above the ground, like a child breaks stalks of grass. The broken ends and ground covered with an unusual green slime. It was like nothing I had seen before in all my many travels into the wild. It looked like it had been ejected from a toothpaste tube, but the interior of the jelly contained strands of a very minute vegetable matter. This was impressed in the interior like it came out of 5 separate orifices, and it held its position in the mass of gelatin. Overall consistency was like thick tapioca pudding, and it gave the simulation of phosphorescence in the dim light of the trail. As you might imagine from my discussion, I spent some time trying to decipher the meaning of all what I was seeing, as the sight reminded me of the Tunguska blast in Russia or the aftermath of Mount St. Helens. Many of the trees were laying up the hill. A short while later, I arrived at the site where I had intended to place the monument. I returned for this and made placement fast, as I still had to take samples and return to the vehicles before it got too dark to pick berries. When I completed this task, I turned to take a few samples and heard an unusual echo from the surrounding hill. An extended echo that wasn't mine coming up the hill from above me. Now, let me tell you, in the time that I have been mining, I have had several guns pointed in my face. I had no desire to be shot by some wayward hayseed in the hills, so I dropped my supplies and traveled out into a rock slide that went all the way up the hill, a vantage point from which I would surely see the maker of the sound. Well, such was not the case, so I cupped my hands to my face and called to the maker of the sound. Moments later, the hillside exploded in a blaze of fury. Falling through the trees, I could make out a large black shape, and my first impression was that my call had dislodged a large nest or tree limb from above. But as it continued to crash in Rambo fashion, I knew I was seeing a living creature, big and black. It had to be a bear, a cub perhaps, and I began to look for the mother. As it rolled through, I could see arms gripping for a handhold and a creature far bigger than a cub. This had to be a grizzly, judging from its size, and it was rolling right towards me. Not a good place to be with an injured bear. I saw every form of mauling death in those first few moments and prepared for a quick and painful death at the claws of this thing, and then it was over. The behemoth laid on the trail dead, or unconsciously. Couldn't tell. Better yet, I couldn't make out head or tail on what I was seeing. It just looked like a mass of hair. I surveyed my situation in the few moments and decided to walk towards the thing and see if I could get around it and escape. Just then, it began to stir, and I prepared to die. I saw first one hand and then another extending from the sides of this thing. Expecting a 4-footed stance, you can imagine my surprise when it stood up straight like a man, and its buttocks was about eye level. I pulled my .22 caliber pistol and tried to fire a round up into the air, but was so rattled that I forgot the safety and it wouldn't fire. By now I was so engrossed in the magnificent size of this beast, I just stood there and took in all I could, determined that if I survived, I had to remember all I was seeing. Its back was absolutely enormous. I marveled at its muscle bundles and definition. The hair was jet black and about 3 inches long over most of its body. The hair on its head grew in a large cape about 24 inches long and in long tassels from the edges of its arms and legs, swishing like a spaniel dog as it walked. Its face was a ruddy brown with deep-set wrinkles under the eye sockets and eyes as dark as coal. Its nose was short and black with a beard or mustache that grew from the bridge of its nose. Lower, the beard resembled some aspects of the buffalo. I thought it quite odd because I could see various forms of mythological beasts in my own visual description to myself. Later, I fired a shot over its right shoulder. It turned and looked at me, and then just walked away down the trail like I didn't matter. A living Goliath. As I stood there, I was unsure of what to do. The gun was obviously little protection, but I did have explosives down the trail in my rock bag. My thought was to get to them, and I could easily scare this thing away and make my break for it. As I walked down the trail, though, I spotted something crouching near my supplies. It was the creature, and it was doing something. Digging? While thinking that this was possibly a method of hiding killed prey, I decided to get a closer look and make sure it wasn't one of my party. But as I got closer, it picked up a rock the size of a basketball and beat it on the ground 3 times. I decided this was bad and began to back up. Now it seemed like I became the hunted, and it turned and ran my direction. I turned and ran for all it was worth toward the rock slide and down the hill. The creature crested the hill above me and began a longitudinal traverse of the hillside, ripping out everything that stood in its way. It looked like the scenes of a Tasmanian devil cartoon. This thing destroyed whole trees as it mowed through them, pushing them aside like I would small twigs. Rocks, branches, and all form of debris came my direction, as if they were being hit with some beam of anti-gravitational force. It was so surreal that it was shocking, and I stopped several times when I could run no further. Surprisingly, when I stopped, it stopped, and when I ran, it ran. During the pauses, it would make that banging sound again, just long enough to enlist a response. I ran to within 300 feet of the road before I decided to give up, and then it turned and went back into the forest. As I broke out to the road, they tell me I emptied the clip of my gun. Of that, I have no memory. When I returned home, I was too distraught to talk to my wife or acknowledge my friend Kevin, who was visiting. I just went into the shower and scrubbed until I began to bleed. I then collapsed in the tub and began to sob, shaking with the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. That night, I recounted the story of what I had seen. A curse that led to repeated bizarre nightmares and sleep deprivation. Unusual, terrifying aspects for which I have no explanation. On that note, I will leave you to digest my story. I consider myself to be a very rational man. I have seen bears in the wild and hunted the same. What I saw wasn't a bear. It seemed to be a living creature that was capable of being hurt, albeit to higher levels of pain than a man could survive. It also appeared to revisit this site on a yearly routine. As you become more involved with this subject, you will notice that Science finds what it wants. It affords the research that it wants, and those who seem most devoted to the topic are not. Those who do believe, those who have had the experience, are few. They make the periodic visit to the media if time allows, and they tell their stories even though they don't get paid for these appearances. All we want are the answers that will again let us live a normal life, a life in which the world is a far bigger place, and we feel humbled by the magnificence of God. So that is the conclusion of the second encounter. Wow, that is an amazing encounter. There's so much in here. The scene that looked like the Tasmanian devil ripping through the trees and rocks and just smashing everything. That scene in this encounter obviously changed this gentleman's life. And in past discussions that I've had with those who have had first-hand encounters with Bigfoot, it typically is that same scenario. They're never quite the same person. It changes them. And like this person mentioned in their encounter, all we want are the answers that will again let us live a normal life. A life in which the world is a far bigger place, and we feel humbled by the magnificence of God. I've also heard it described as, here I am standing looking at this thing that should not be there, and yet it is. Have any of you had that situation? Have you had a first-hand encounter? If you have, I would really, really love to hear your story. There are so many people out there that have experienced such things as these, and whether they're just so traumatized by the event that they won't come forward, perhaps they are afraid of the ridicule which is certain to come from them stepping forward and telling their story. More and more people coming forward, it can only help people like this to come forward with their story, because if it's traumatic to them, that can begin the healing process. So yeah, anyone that has an encounter, it would be great if you would consider sharing it with someone you trust. So yeah, that's the conclusion of our 2 encounters for tonight, both from the state of Washington. And that second encounter, I found that phenomenal. So leave me some comments. What do you guys think of these encounters? Do you have any thoughts as far as those areas where these encounters took place? So look forward to hearing from you. I appreciate you all joining us tonight for the 2 stories. Hope you have a great night. And as always, we'll see you on the next.